Good afternoon, everyone. It is my deep pleasure to be here. I want to thank APA for this opportunity to address you today. And the focus of my talk is on why psychology should care about racial and ethnic diversity. And in particular, why psychology as a science and as a field, why diversity, equity, and inclusion is paramount for our future success. So as Noe had noted in my introduction, I've spent the entirety of my career, 30-something years, focusing on understanding the psychological meaning and significance of race in the lives of African Americans. But over the last 8 years, from a year ago today, I spent time in the evil administration serving as a chief diversity officer, having an opportunity to put to practice many of the things that we've learned in psychology. In that particular arena, and sometimes it really was an arena, as chief diversity officer, I spent a lot of time thinking and explaining why diversity, equity, and inclusion is important in higher education. And in those conversations, there's really basically 4 types of explanations or rationales. The first is that it is simply the socially just thing to do. It's the social justice argument I like to refer to. And this recognizes the fact that there are societal inequities, both historical and contemporary, that limit certain communities' opportunities to be successful and have pathways through higher education. In other words, that while talent is equally distributed across different communities, opportunity is not, and thus we need to have concerted diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in higher education. The second argument that's often portrayed is based off of that first point and the first premise, and it's the morally right thing to do argument. That is just simply the morally right thing to do, that we diversify higher education in as many ways as we possibly can. The third argument is an argument that in many ways was supported by the University of Michigan in the previous Gratz-Grutter Supreme Court case that was just basically struck down in the latest ruling, and that is showing that diversity, equity, and inclusion is really important in terms of our students' experience and education with regards to education. The argument basically goes, the world is getting smaller, that as people interact with people from very different backgrounds, in order to adequately prepare our students, it's important that in our universities, they have an opportunity to engage and interact with folks who are different from them. And that those students who do end up having better educational experiences than those students who don't. But the last argument is the one that we ended up adopting at the University of Michigan as a rationale for why we have committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion as a key strategy for us. And that's that diversity is actually the key to academic excellence. That you cannot be excellent without being diverse. And at the University of Michigan, we like to believe our job is about excellence. So we're a little arrogant in terms of that. Our fight song says we're the leaders and best, and we actually believe that. And so our argument is, in order to be leaders and best, we must also be diverse. We need different perspectives in order to actually become excellent. Now, some of you may say, okay, both that's a little bit arrogant, and where's the data that backs that up? The reality is there's a large literature that shows diversity, equity, and inclusion, that particularly diversity is an important factor in problem solving. That more diverse groups ultimately are able to come up with more solutions, more creative solutions, and ultimately more successful solutions than more homogeneous groups. So there's literature in psychology, literature in sociology and business management, in complex systems that all point to this. But beyond the research, it also fits the lived experience test. So like right now, if I said, I've got $1,000 and I want you to solve a problem in a group, and you have a choice with 5 people in your group of being in one of 2 groups. One in which every single person in the group is exactly like you, that knows exactly what you know, doesn't know exactly what you don't know, or you could be in a group in which the people that are in there will have very different experiences, different strengths, different weaknesses. Chances are most of us would select that diverse group, right? Anyone disagree? Well, the challenge is, and again, the data show this, that is absolutely true. But the data also shows that diverse groups are hard. That people find being in diverse groups harder than being in groups that are made up of people that are just like them. Not surprising. When you go to a cocktail party, the first thing you do is look for similarity and not difference. That's just the conditions that we are. You look for someone with a similar shirt from a similar institution, or somebody that looks like you in some way, shape, or form. So diversity doesn't just happen, it requires us to work at it. Now, the other thing about diversity is it's not enough. So in this larger political debate, you often hear people talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they often talk about DEI or EDI or DEIJ, number of different frameworks. But it's important to understand that it's never just about diversity. That the reality is diversity is a necessary condition to get optimal group performance in terms of problem solving. But it is an insufficient condition. You must also have equity and inclusion in those environments if you're going to reap the benefits of diversity. So for instance, that same group that you have, you got this super team of 5 very diverse people with different backgrounds and different experiences. And you're ready to go to work to solve this particular problem. You know you're going to get it done. But 2 individuals are particularly quiet because 5 minutes before, they were questioned with regards to why they were actually here based on their social identity. Another person, because of the rules of the game, isn't allowed to say anything. So while you might have all the answers or all what you need to come up with the most creative, the most successful answers, you're not able to do it because of the experiences of other members of your group in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, usually when we have this argument, we get to this point where those who disagree with me will say, on the one hand, yeah, the diversity thing makes sense. Yeah, we do want diversity ideas. But my problem with all this DEI stuff is you focus on social identities. You talk about race, you talk about gender, you talk about sexual identity and orientation, class, ability status, et cetera. What we really just need is a diversity of ideas and diversity of perspectives. Okay, I would agree with that. That makes perfect sense. But where does that diversity of ideas and perspectives come from? Usually it comes from perceptions and appraisals and construals of the particular problem at hand. People asking different questions or looking at it slightly different. But where do those perceptions and appraisals come from? Come from schemas, worldviews, the way in which we see the world. And how are those worldviews and schemas shaped? From our lived experience. Anyone disagree with anything so far? Psychology would back up every single thing that I've just said there. But what about those life experiences and social identities? I dare anyone to be able to make an argument that one's life experience isn't shaped in large part by the different social identities and the configuration and be it intersections of identities that we actually have. So you cannot really effectively get to diversity of perspectives without also dealing with the issue of differences in social identity. This issue is particularly important with regards to the science of psychology. In that, as all sciences, the science of psychology is very much concerned with problem solving. But it's even more relevant given that not only are we involved in problem solving, but the psychology of science is also fundamentally about human behavior. Note, I didn't say some human behavior or parts of human behavior, but it's about human behavior. Unlike any other true science, it's about human behavior. And so in order to effectively cover the breadth of human behavior, it is important that those experiences and perspectives that cut across all of the communities are also involved. We have a problem as a field. We are not particularly diverse in any manner, shape, or form in terms of who's actually doing our studies, in terms of what we actually study, and in terms of who is being studied. So in many ways, it's just plain bad science in terms of our ability to actually generalize across human behavior, because we are limited in who's doing the studies, what topics are being studied, and who is actually being studied. So I'll give you a concrete example. As I mentioned earlier, my research focuses on the psychological role of race in the lives of African Americans. And when I first began as an undergraduate student, knowing that I wanted to be a psychologist, even though I didn't really know what a psychologist did, but I knew I wanted to be a psychologist. When I began to look in the existing literature at that time, and I looked for the experiences of African Americans, basically, we didn't exist in much of the mainstream psychological literature. And where we did exist, we exist as examples of deviation from the norm, deviance, or as stimuli for whites' attitudes, beliefs related to prejudice, stereotyping, etc. We were not centered in any of the existing literature at the time when I came into the field. And as a result, if one attempted to understand that aspect of the human experience that is both unique and common amongst African Americans, you'd have a very, very distorted picture. And this was not necessarily based on any efforts of malice. In some instances it was, but in other cases it was actually out of the hope of supporting African Americans, with the notion that by showing the deviance in African American behavior, we're showing how horrible stigma actually is. But the problem is, in those approaches, we defined African Americans in some way as being less than. And not only was that problematic for African Americans, I would argue it was extremely problematic for the way in which psychology actually was doing its work, that the science of psychology also suffers. At the time, the notion of what the experience of African Americans was highly tied to this notion of stigma, that the best way to understand African Americans' experiences was in the context of stigma, that they're a stigmatized group. And as a non-African American, that would be the most salient aspect of who African Americans were, was as a stigmatized group. And often you'll read in this notion is based on a model or a framework that would think about African Americans in the context of someone with a horrible scar on their face, a mark of oppression, and what that must be like. But the problem with that work, and the problem with not having diversity in the people who are actually conceptualizing the challenge and conceptualizing the experience, is that you also have the potential of missing the mark. So by thinking of African Americans as folks with a scar or a stigmata, not only were we missing African Americans, but we're also missing out on folks with stigmatas. So what you would get would be framing of their experience that would say things like it must be so difficult to walk around stigmatized in that particular way with a scar. But the reality is, if you have never had that scar, you're missing the boat. So as a person walking by, doing an objective view from an objective perspective, you see that scar and you say, ooh, that must be a horrible thing. Oh, I have pity for that person, or I have empathy for that person. Oh, the pain that that person must feel. When in fact, we don't really understand what that scar must feel like for the person. For some people, they were born with the scar. It's not a defining characteristic. They don't walk around thinking about the scar. In fact, the scar, they forget it. They're just a person. They're either happy, they're sad, they're excited, they're bored, whatever. But it's not, the scar is not the defining characteristic. For other people, They may be very proud of that scar. Wow, that scar is really important because I got that scar saving my little brother in a fire when I was 5. There may be a different story around it. But we don't know any of that. All we see is the scar and how the scar makes us feel. And as psychologists and as researchers, that can throw us off in terms of the types of questions and the way in which we conceptualize and frame the experiences of the individual with the scar. And similarly, when we don't have opportunities for other racially diverse, sexually diverse, gender diverse, ability status diverse, other perspectives, then we miss out on understanding human behavior. That our understanding of human behavior is limited. And when our understanding of human behavior is limited, then so is psychology. And so what I want to leave you today is an argument that psychology's future is determined as a science by the extent to which, as a field, we can become more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive. Because if we don't, we risk simply that psychology becomes invalid as a science, that it doesn't really measure the breadth of human behavior that we often think it's supposed to represent as a science. It also then has the risk and runs the risk of being impotent, not being able to actually contribute to the many problems that we as a society face today. Psychology has great power to address many of those problems. We saw this in the context of COVID. Often COVID was defined in terms of a biological problem. Once we found the cure or the vaccination, it should go away. But it was fundamentally a behavioral problem. But if psychology isn't valid, it's going to be impotent to solve those problems, global warming, inequities in the world, political problems, etc. And if it becomes impotent to solving those problems, then psychology ultimately runs the risk of being irrelevant. If it cannot contribute to who we are as a society in the future, then the question is, what good is it? What good is psychology if it is not relevant? If it's invalid, if it's impotent, it becomes irrelevant. So I hope that today I've at least got you to think a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion and its importance to psychology, not from the necessary standpoint that, yes, it's the right thing to do, and yes, there's social justice arguments for it, because I believe in all of those things, but ultimately we're all in this together. And that if psychology doesn't become more diverse, equitable, and inclusive, it is psychology that will ultimately pay that price. So I want to thank you all for enduring my conversation today, and I hope you have a great APA. Thank you very much.